Hi, everybody, and welcome to another great episode of the IaC Podcast. I'm your host for today. My name is Ohad Maislish. You can follow me at DevOps Ohad. And today we have, wow, an amazing guest. We have Elad Ben-Israel. Hi, Elad.
Hey, Ohad. How are you? Great to be here.
Thank you. Uh, for those who don't know Elad is the creator of CDK. And we're going to talk a lot about CDK today, but Elad, maybe give some of your background. Tell us about yourself.
Um, 43 years old. I live in Tel Aviv with my husband and 5-year-old twins. And I mean, I've been programming since I remember myself. Basically, I think since I was like 10 or 9 or 10, started hacking on Atari and PC XT 80 286 386 486 Pentium processors, right? So always been really with a keyboard in my hand. Besides 1 year where my partner forced me to not pick up my laptop when we started traveling in China, which was a really interesting experience, not having a keyboard with me. But yeah, I love software. For me, software is magical, like truly, truly magical. It's you give something a name and it becomes a thing, right? Like it's just the essence of software is like you write class, I don't know, user, and you have a user, right? Like just giving
Yep.
it that name becomes that thing, and that's kind of like the very core magic of building
Awesome.
abstractions. And so yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And you've talked about software. So let's talk about a very important piece of software that you created, which is CDK. So you've been working for Amazon in the past, and you decided that CDK needs to be created. How? Tell us the story. How did that happen?
Yeah, so basically, I didn't decide CDK needs to be created. I just had pain.
Correct. Yeah.
And for me, it's always been I want to be more productive. I want to be more efficient as a developer. I want to have, I just want to have the right tools. I can't chop off a huge sequoia tree with a small saw, right? Like you need the right saw
Mhm.
to. And so the CDK was created because we were building this big data analytics system, like real time analytics system at Amazon Search, and that service basically was ingesting all of the Amazon.com's events because like huge scale from day one, let's call it. And there's something really fun about having these like very clear constraints related to scale and availability from day one of your project. I think it's a pretty unique thing, when you're building something in big tech, from day one you really have to handle. In most projects, it takes years before you get to these days. So for me, it's like really helpful to have like very clear constraints from day one, and it was clear that it made a lot of sense to lean a lot on the cloud, to use a lot of like cloud managed services in order to avoid having to deal with operational with many of the operational aspects that are related to the scale. So we use Lambda and Kinesis and DynamoDB and serverless technologies and containers, but but when you do that, you basically when you lean a lot on the cloud, you end up with a system that I would say maybe even more than half of this of your system is basically infrastructure, which is really a unique thing that's happening with the cloud, right? Like it's kind of like this spectrum. Like some systems rely a lot on external services, and some systems rely only a little on external services. And the more you lean on the cloud, you have this dependency, this coupling between your application code and your infrastructure code. and and having two different tools to manage these two parts of your system, or having completely two different soft programming paradigms,
Yep.
was doesn't make sense. I'm a programmer, and when I end up like copying and pasting YAML, I feel like I'm not doing
You-
my job.
You're talking about cloud formation, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we use CloudFormation. We're Amazon. Not that Amazon's forcing anyone to use CloudFormation. It's sometimes some something that people don't understand about Amazon. Internally, Amazon has this really strong ethos of like, use the tools that work for you. You don't have to use Amazon tools or AWS tools. And I think that's one of the reasons Amazon's really creating this culture of like, the internal teams are really forcing the external services to become better, because they really expect those services to be great tools. They're not forced to use them. And so we used CloudFormation, and I think CloudFormation is a very powerful tool and very useful. And when you're building on AWS, the guarantees, the transactional guarantees, the safety it gives you, that's people sometimes underestimate that, especially when you're building production, high scale production systems. And so yeah, I've been copying and pasting YAML, and like I'm like buried in all this YAML, and okay, this is not how I want to manage complexity as a developer. I've seen a better world, um, and that's how the CDK basically was born. Because for me, it was like, okay, I want
Was
to go ahead.
was that before or after Pulumi started a
It
similar
was
approach?
before. It was before. It was before Pulumi, and I actually moved to AWS at some point, and we built this internal solution that was kind of like the prototype for the CDK, and used it in this real project, which was really a great use case. And basically the way it worked is like, I we finished this project earlier, and I think partly because we could be really more efficient with how we use infrastructure. And then I started road showing, like pitching the project across Amazon. And Amazon, if has this like press release um, thing where you write a one pager that basically describes a press release from the future. And so I wrote this press release, and I picked up this press release, and I started scheduling.
That's a fascinating approach in order to define and measure and make decisions on future projects.
Yeah, I use it all the
How,
time today.
how different is that future press release that you wrote than the actual results of happened? Did you implement exactly what you thought would be implemented, or there's some surprises in the way?
So it's surprisingly exact.
The same.
It's
That's amazing.
unbelievable. And not only I wrote this press release, I also created this like mind map at that point, because I was like, as I was starting the project, I had all these ideas, and I was like, kind of like could see this vision, and see like what I wanted to look like. And so I used this tool to create a mind map. And 4 years later, after the project kind of started to pick up, I ran into this mind map, and that was amazing to see, right? Like, that was really cool to see how like all of these branches of ideas, again, some of them were more mature than I expected, some were less, some areas we invested more and some were less, obviously. But it's really amazing to see how, and it more amazing is like, fuck, this took 4 years, right? Like, it took so long to get this little thing. um so yeah,
Awesome.
pitched it to AWS, and they were like, yeah, we actually have some capacity to bring in someone and try and see if that might work. And so I moved over, and we had like one person join me, two people team, kind of just starting the open source. Is like, okay,
The,
let's just put it out there.
the best projects start with one or two, a very small team of great professionals. But in addition to AWS employees in that small team, another big help you got from the community, right?
Yes, yes, that was very early on. we obviously knew we wanted to build it as an open source project because it's a big class library.
Wait. You work for you said that it was clear, but you work for a company that maybe it's not that clear that something will be open source, right?
Yeah, I think it's not about whether it's clear or not. It's just that Amazon doesn't have a strong culture of contributing to open source and publishing open source.
Hmm.
But it's not a dogmatic resistance, if that makes sense, right? Like it's not like
Yep.
Amazon is like don't believe in open source or we don't think that that's the right way to do things. It's
Yeah.
just culturally not what people are thinking about.
Or oriented in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the lessons I learned from this project was that if you want to build something in open source, you should probably start in the open. Like it's almost impossible, especially when you're building working in building something within like a big company engineering environment. It's really hard to like scrape it and get it ready to become a public thing, right? Like it's because you're using all these internal tools and assumptions, and so and I've been at Amazon for about, I think it was 3 years already. So I kind of understood this. I knew I've actually created some like internal open source tool there to build software inside containers, something, whatever. It's a different story. And so I had some experience kind of like creating these internal tools. And I knew that if I wanted this to be something that other people can use outside of Amazon, it has to start as an external project. And then I basically looked for the team at Amazon that had the right mindset. And that was this SDK team, the team that's basically publishing the AWS SDK. And so for them, they're already used to working with, as an open source project. And so that kind of
Yep.
created the right alignment internally.
Yep. So how do you create a community? And after that question, I want to share some data that I have about CDK, but this is a
Right.
teaser.
Now I'm curious.
So so yeah, let's talk about the community. How do you build a community? How do you
Well,
start?
to be honest, when we started the CDK project, I had no clue at all. Like it was a
Mhm.
completely organic process. And in hindsight, it's a huge privilege to be able to do something like that. When you're publishing open source from big tech, from a platform like Amazon, you do have the privilege of like basically just build it and they will come type mindset. It's like, okay, we're just gonna put this. And it's not that it was like immediately super successful, right? Like I remember actually like switching the repo from private to public, and we were kind of like getting ready for that for like a whole month. And
Where did you do that? Because sometimes those things are done on a big stage, and a lot of people,
so
it was in your home that you just changed that without
so
any.
we said let's do like a soft launch, like just put it out there.
Uh-huh.
We're not even going to write about it or talk about it or do anything. We're just like make the repo public and see what happens. And I remember actually like doing that and expecting like a flood of people to like join this project, because it's like it was on the AWS GitHub org, and so
Yep.
I'm expecting people refreshing that GitHub org and waiting for new things to pop up, right? Like that's my mindset, and nothing.
Obviously,
Obviously,
everybody's refreshing
of
the GitHub
course,
page of Amazon.
all the time, especially given
Yeah.
Amazon is very strong open source, and so yeah, nothing happened basically. Um, but then it's kind of like, as you expect an organic thing to happen, right? Like there's like this little drips of people
Yep.
finding about it, and suddenly someone's opening an issue, and suddenly
Mhm.
someone's submitting a little pull request to fix a typo in their docs, and so it's slowly building up towards a community. And 5 years later, and I'm now building another big open source project, and I don't have the privilege of doing that from an Amazon stage, and so now I have to be a bit more intentional and a bit more explicit about the process. And so it was a really interesting thing to kind of like reflect back and see like what worked, and like how did this happen, right? Like what was the
Right. So
and
let,
so I
let
think, so go ahead.
so let me share some information about CDK. CDK has more than 10,000 GitHub stars, and I think even maybe more interesting, it has 1,200 contributors to the open source, which is unbelievable. Another thing that we've done in my company, in NF0, we had a survey, and we've asked about 400 DevOps engineers which infrastructure as code tools are you using or planning on using, and you can select more than one answer. Not surprisingly, the first top answer was Terraform with 74%. Second, I know you don't like YAMLs, but the honest truth is that the second place was CloudFormation with 31%. So both Terraform and CloudFormation, the YAML approach, and then Azure ARM templates, TerraGrant, and then CDK with about 8% using or planning on using CDK, which is more than Pulumi and Crossplane combined. So that's super interesting to see the adoption of your project being used for it by so many people.
Yeah, I think some it's also interesting to the point that like CDK and Terraform and CDK and CloudFormation are not apples to apples in a sense,
Yep.
because
Mm-hmm.
CDK uses CloudFormation, AWS CDK uses CloudFormation, and so basically using the CDK means that you're using CloudFormation and vice versa. When you use CloudFormation, sometimes you're like you're going to start with CloudFormation and then eventually you're like, wait, I can actually use all these high level abstractions and become more efficient. And so we see a lot, obviously, a lot of the adoption of the CDK comes from that journey of like, you know, just going up the abstraction stack in a sense. And that's the same for Terraform, because at some point, I ran into Armand Dadgar from HashiCorp at one of the reInvents, and he was like, we were like, I was telling him, that there's this community, like someone from the community that just published CDK for Terraform, like some initial kind of project, and he
Mm-hmm.
was super curious about that, and we followed up, and actually I connected him with this guy Sebastian Korfman, who eventually started working
Too
with
hashy.
us, and they built CDK for Terraform as a spin-off for the CDK. And CDK for Terraform is using all of the low-level technologies of the CDK, like constructs and JSII, and the design, right? It's basically the same family of tools. And then we also spinned off CDK for Kubernetes. And so
Mm-hmm.
the way I'm thinking about the CDK is more as a programming model, right? Like not
Yeah.
specifically an IaC tool, right? Like as a programming model for
Yeah.
desired state. And everywhere there's a use case for desired state, that model is proving itself pretty well. Another example is I don't know if you know my little pet project called Progen. Have
No,
you
tell us
heard?
about it. No.
So it's a Progen with a J, and it's in a sense it's like CDK for GitHub repositories, if that makes
Okay.
any sense. It doesn't. But it's like the problem it's solving is basically when you're building software today, you're basically integrating dozens of different tools for your software development tool chain, right? Like your compiler and testing and linters and release workflows and versioning bumps, and like there's a million things that kind of like all need to be integrated together, and they're all reflected in your GitHub repo eventually, right? Like there's like configuration files in your GitHub repo, and at some point we were starting to release all these libraries for in the CDK team, like different separate libraries that are not part of the core CDK library, and all of these libraries needed the same tool chain. And so I said,
Yep.
you know what, maybe I can write some code that generates all these JSON files so that I can reproduce this exact configuration and I can update it from a centralized place, right? Like the same use case, basically. and that
Yeah,
turned
it
out to be a CDK for projects, for repositories.
yeah, that reminds me of, I think, the GitHub Terraform provider in a way that you can, you know, uh, put some settings in your GitHub and manage that with code because it's repeatable for different GitHub repos that you want to manage the same way. So yeah,
Yeah,
everything this way or the other, everything becomes less ClickOps and more code based.
exactly.
And CDK approach and the imperative approach is definitely something that simplifies, for the developers to do things in a way that is more natural. However, we see Pulumi releasing YAML support, so we can never know.
Yeah, I think.
Developers want to have it all options.
Yeah, and I think one of the takeaways that I came out of from the CDK was that these tools are used both by developers and by DevOps engineers. And DevOps engineers are kind of like this interesting crowd because some of them come from dev and some of them come from ops. And I mean, they're called DevOps, right? And so if you take that path that comes from ops in a sense, right, like from the IT operations or administrative crowd, then you would find more people who are interested in using configuration files and YAML and declarative. Like they're not as comfortable with imperative object-oriented programming, right? Like that's which makes total sense, right? Like because these folks kind of came from like configuring routers and data centers and setting up power supply matrices, right? Like so
Yep.
it's like a
Yep.
different direction to come to this world of cloud infrastructure. And so I can totally understand why, yeah, like why Pulumi is releasing YAML and why you're in your survey, the top tools are actually coming from the infrastructure IT world, and Terraform and
Yep.
CloudFormation. That's kind of like the foundation. But what we're seeing is that we're seeing more and more, and I think that's related to what I said earlier, is like the more you use the cloud, the more you lean on the cloud, when you're building applications as a developer, the more you want to be able to bring in the infrastructure into your code, which is in a sense the project that I'm working on right now is
Yeah.
where this is, you know, this is the epiphany of that in my head, right?
Yeah, so maybe let's finish with that. You've built an amazing open source with the help of a great community. And tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. You're also building a very interesting thing that will help developers affect the cloud operations in a much more meaningful way. So yeah, what's next?
Yeah, so I after about 5.5 years at Amazon building the CDK, and 3 years doing other things at Amazon, I'm like, okay, maybe big tech is not, maybe it's enough for now. Although Amazon's been an amazing journey, I really really enjoyed working there. And but the CDK got to the point where I'm like, okay, this is great. This is going in the right direction. My mind map is already mostly covered. I can move on maybe to the next thing. But I'm still obviously very obsessed about cloud and obsessed about developer experience and developer productivity, and with the CDK, it always felt like there's this glass ceiling of what can I express using the existing languages that we use. Because as I said earlier, when you're thinking about cloud applications, they're both infrastructure and code, right? Like they go together. And the more
Yep.
you use infrastructure, that's coupled more and more. And that coupling is something that creates a lot of friction in today's industry, right? Because if you think about these things separately, but they're actually really coupled, you end up with a lot of boilerplate and a lot of glue logic and a lot of cruft that's just related to stitching together these two pieces. It's kind of like, sometimes I'm thinking about it as like CSS HTML or JavaScript HTML, kind of like what React had done to the front end world. When you have like HTML and JavaScript and they're completely divorced, but they're actually super coupled. And you really want to create a unified programming model that can model your entire picture. And so what we're doing now is we're actually creating a programming language for that, because I realize that existing languages they're designed to think about a computer as a machine, right? They have these fundamental assumptions around the boundaries of your program, right? Like your program is running inside a machine, so it has CPU and memory and operating system and network, and but that's it. It's not. It doesn't see the whole story of a cloud application, which is a distributed system, right? And so basically said, let's see what that looks like. What benefits can we create? What experience can we create when we lose some of those assumptions? And it's very, very exciting and very
What's
fascinating.
what's the name? Tell us the name of this new language.
So it's called Wing, as in a wing. It's very, very corny, very corny, of course. You go to the cloud and all that. Or Wing Lang, and it's very early. Like we released our alpha in December, and so just starting to get going. But it's open source, obviously, and
Obviously.
the work on the community has been more intentional, and being more intentional means that it's surprisingly more effective, and like we see this amazing contributions already of like substantial features of the language, and the compiler and the SDK that we're building, and so that's really fulfilling. And more than anything, as always for me, it's just like when I'm using this thing, I'm falling in love every time. And that was the same exact feeling I had with the CDK, right? Like for me, it's just making sure that I have that feeling as a developer. As I said, grew up with that keyboard. So I just want to make sure that that's the tool that we're building.
Amazing, amazing. So you've built not just one, but two, or starting to build a second amazing open source that might change the way developers operate with the cloud. This is a fascinating story, Elad. Thank you very much for joining our podcast today,
Thank
and
you,
thank you
man.
for our and thank you, our great audience, for listening for in today's conversation. If you like the podcast, please follow us in Twitter, the IaC Podcast, and you can just go to our website, the IaCPodcast.com, and listen to more episodes. I was your host for today, Ohad Maizlish. Thank you for joining, and see you next time. Thank you, Elad. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.